Today, what I want to do with you guys is have a bit more of a serious discussion about some of the things that take place in the marketplace, that take place in collectibles in general, that we really don't talk about all that often, but I think it's stuff that's really interesting from an ethics and moral standpoint that don't necessarily have one clear answer. So let's just start with a completely made up hypothetical scenario here, and I'm curious to hear your guys' thoughts. So in this story, we have three people. The first person is the seller. They have a rare game, they do not know the value of it, they know nothing. The other two people are buyer 1 and buyer 2. Both of these people know everything about the market, they know exactly what the game is worth, and we're gonna see how this plays out. So the seller randomly shows up in a Facebook group with a rare, expensive video game. Let's just say they had Chrono Cross, for example. They come to a Facebook group and they say, hey, I found this game, it's factory sealed, how much is this worth? What do you guys think I should do with it? Now we entered buyer 1. They see this post on Facebook, they message the seller, they start having a conversation, and buyer 1 knows that that game could be worth up to $500. So buyer 1 starts talking with the seller and they offer $100 for the item. They know that they are completely lowballing on the item, but that's the offer that they make. Now the seller is super excited about this because the seller only thought this game might be worth like $50. So this $100 offer, they're like, oh my god, yeah, like sounds good, we'll do $100 for it. So the seller and buyer 1 now have a verbal agreement that yes, they will sell the game for $100, but no money has traded hands yet. They say they'll do it tomorrow, there's an issue, whatever reason. No money trades hands, they both go to bed, the next day comes. Now buyer 2 enters into the story, they see the same Facebook post, they approach the seller and they say, hey, I'll make you an offer of $300 for this item. Now again, seller was just excited they were going to get $100 for the item. Now we're talking $300, and this is also getting much closer to the actual fair market value of the item. So now the seller goes back to buyer 1 and they say, hey, I have an offer of $300. Are you able to match that? And buyer 1 either can't match the offer because it's too much money, or they're unwilling to match the offer. But of course, buyer 1 is also very upset that the seller now went back on the agreed upon deal. They had agreed on $100. The seller then tells them, I'm gonna have to go and accept the higher offer, really sorry about that. Buyer 2 ends up with the item. Now as I tell that story, you might have ideas in your head as to who's the good guy in the story, the bad guy, who's neutral, and I want you to keep those ideas. Now I want to introduce the exact same story to you guys, but let's say the seller shows up with a game that could be worth up to $40,000. So again, buyer 1 shows up and makes an offer of $10,000, knowing full well that the game could be worth up to $40,000. Same thing happens, no money actually trades hands. The next day, buyer 2 shows up and offers $30,000. The seller agrees to sell the game to buyer 2 because, of course, right? That's so much money. When I increase the amounts of money to being $10,000, $20,000 of difference, does that change for you who is the bad guy, the good guy in the story? Should the seller of the item in this instance feel any kind of obligation to honor their word to sell the item to the original buyer? Is the seller a bad person for taking the larger amount of money despite having a verbal agreement? And you know, a lot of the immediate emphasis is going to go towards the actions of the seller in this case, but not a lot of thought immediately goes towards buyer 1, who knowingly engaged in predatory behavior on the seller who does not know what's going on. And remember, there was no sales post. It's not like buyer 1 was simply walking up and paying an advertised price. They knowingly shot a lowball offer forward to a person who does not know the value of the item. So the way I see this scenario, and of course you're free to agree or disagree, this is just my personal opinion, is that buyer 2 is completely neutral. They had nothing to do with it. They just made a much more fair offer and ended up with the game. Now the seller, in my opinion, has absolutely no obligation to honor the initial transaction when it was done under a predatory pretense. For myself, it's akin to if you were to agree to a timeshare or something because you thought you were getting a good deal, and then someone walked in and is like, man, no, you can't accept that deal, it's absolutely terrible, and then they try to strong arm you into still completing the deal because, oh, you said you would. In those types of scenarios, I do not blame a seller or anyone really for walking away from a negotiation if the information changes drastically, and if the information that was presented initially was just bad. I know a lot of people will say you have to honor the word or honor the agreement, honor the transaction, but I don't see it that way. I don't think that's nearly as black and white. And then we talk about buyer 1. On the surface, I don't have any issue with someone making a knowing lowball. We all do that, right? If you've been in the collectibles hobby for a while, if you've been buying and selling, you have gone up to someone and lowballed the shit out of them for some of their items. Sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't work out, but you know, you're always gonna shoot the lowball forward. For myself, if I send a lowball to someone, then I fully accept that I might not get the item and I have no expectation for the seller to honor an agreement or anything like that. If it works out, great. If not, I just move on with my life, nothing gained, nothing lost. Buyer 1 in this scenario though made the lowball to the buyer and then was also very, very upset that the seller would not sell it to them for the initial price. Now that's where I get a much more sour taste in my mouth, because all of a sudden you have a sense of entitlement for that item when you were being predatory in nature to try and get it. Sorry I keep using the word predatory, I know it has different connotation, but it's really the only way I can explain this. And I'm sure there are some of you guys out there who immediately thought that buyer 1 was the victim of this scenario because they had the deal canceled on them. Which then brings in another topic here of why does empathy in the collectibles field in marketplaces only flow towards the buyer? Everyone will cheer when a buyer gets a great deal. Oh, caught him slipping, bro. You absolutely robbed that guy. Or if a buyer loses out on a really good deal, everyone gets sad for them. Like, oh no, that sucks, you missed out on it. But the thing is, for every buyer missing out on a great sale, there might be a seller who now got a much more fair price for their items. Why is there no celebration for the seller to get a fair price for their items? Most of the community will absolutely chastise a seller who tries to get even 10% above market for their items. Yet we're all supposed to cheer on absolutely robbing people day and night. Had the original transaction gone through between buyer 1 and the seller would have been an absolute victim in that scenario. Yet I don't think people would have been saying, man, I feel bad for the seller. I think everyone would have just been cheering on the buyer who got the great deal. And that's just super weird to me, because let's face it, any buyer who is in a position to pay $20,000 for a luxury video game, their life is not going to change in any way, shape, or form if they do not complete the deal. But for the seller who could receive an additional $500, $5,000, we do not know how much that money may affect their life. Odds are the seller getting additional money is going to have a lot more impact in their life. And keep in mind, I'm only talking about peer-to-peer transactions. I don't care about GameStop, Walmart, or any other video game store where they have the resources, they have the knowledge to put out prices themselves. And just quickly, there is one other topic and spin I want to put on this story, and that's of backdooring someone. And I know a lot of you are already familiar with backdooring, and a lot of people just don't condone it at all. Like, that is completely bad. But if you don't know, the act of backdooring someone is when you knowingly enter into a completed transaction between seller and buyer, and you purposely offer a higher amount to try and get the seller to sell to you instead. That is backdooring someone. So if we go back to the original scenario here, let's say buyer 1 and the seller had completed the deal at $10,000. Money did trade hands. Then buyer 2 enters, messages the seller and says, hey, is this game still available? They say, sorry, it's sold. Buyer 2 then asks, hey, how much did you sell it for? The seller answers, and buyer 2 says, hey, I'll give you an additional $5,000 if you sell it to me instead. Now I ask you again, who is the good person? Who is the bad person? And who are the neutral parties in this transaction? The seller still did absolutely get lowballed by the initial buyer, but they did complete the transaction. Is the seller now a scumbag if they refund the initial $10,000 to accept an additional $5,000? Is buyer 2 a complete scumbag for screwing over buyer 1 on the transaction? And is buyer 1 allowed to be a victim in this scenario when they still knowingly preyed upon this seller? Like I already said, I don't condone the actions of backdooring. I think it's a very scummy behavior because you get all of the reward without any of the work. It's basically entering in a cheat code to go and screw over other buyers. However, I would not blame the seller for canceling the transaction and taking the additional money. I wouldn't at all. And if I was in a scenario where I purposely got lowballed by someone because I had a lack of information, I don't think I would feel bad either about canceling and taking the additional money. And do keep in mind that when I say this, the amount of money does matter. If we're talking $50 to $100, I'm personally not going to sell it. And at that point, I'm like, man, just complete the transaction. But if we get into $1,000, $5,000, $10,000, are we really going to blame the seller for accepting that much more money and getting a fair price for their item just because buyer 1 was able to take advantage of them? And that's just kind of where this all gets weird to me, that in this hobby, in this space, no empathy flows towards the seller who might really need the additional money. We always chastise a seller if they break the agreement or they break the trade, and the buyer is the one who should always get the reward and be the one who's pitied. But I'm super curious to hear your guys' thoughts on this. Those are just my personal thoughts, and trust me, I don't make this video just a moral grandstand on you guys. I have made my fair share of lowballs to people. I have completed my fair share of terrible deals with people. It's all super interesting to me, but I really want to know where a lot of you guys sit on all of this. As always, thanks to every single Patreon member that supports the channel, as well as the Greg gang. Can't do it without you guys either. Hopefully you enjoyed this kind of different conversation today. Hit the like button on the way out, and I'll see you guys in the next video.